We've been studying this concept all week of Sabbath. And so far, we've really spent our thoughts in the area of space. And what I mean by that is not the outer space, but material space, the space we find ourselves in. When we looked at creation on the first reflection this week, we looked at God creating in day 1 through day 6. And God said in all those creations that God was happy with the creation that God had made. And then when he got to day 7, he rests, and we recognize that God created the Sabbath. But one thing we didn't talk about in that reflection was that God did not create anything spatial. Instead, God created a time, a holy time. He sanctified a period of time to be used to be aware of the presence of God and to rest in God and to be dependent on God. What an amazing concept if you really begin to think about it, that God would create a space of time and not just the material space around us, and that God would sanctify and make holy time. This concept came to me as I was studying the Sabbath recently, and I read a book by the famous 20th century rabbi Abraham Heschel. His book is called The Sabbath, or Sabbath. It's very much worth a read. If you haven't read it, I would suggest pick it up. It's a small book. You could read it pretty quickly, but it's dense with a lot of really interesting concepts. And in the first part of the book, he really unpacks this concept of time. He really unpacks the idea that God, in creating the Sabbath, makes holy a period of time and therefore sanctifies all of time and makes us more conscientious of the holiness of God's time as he's created it. So what a crazy, interesting idea that as we're locked in our homes, as we're maybe more aware of our time for some of us is probably crawling and barely moving by. Time for others of us who are stressed and still trying to have to deal with all the regular things in our lives on top of all the news we're hearing about the coronavirus maybe seems to be just flying by, and it just seems like it's so crazy. For others of us, maybe time is a mix of the two. Some days it feels really fast and some days it feels really slow. But in these days, we need to take advantage of the fact that we are more aware of time. We need to take advantage of the fact that our minds are pushed into the realm of time, because we are creatures of not just space, but time. We don't exist just in the material, physical space that God has created, but we also exist experiencing time. We exist in the dimension of time, following it forward. God meant for the Sabbath to be a time set aside that we would remember the presence of God, that we would remember the sanctity and holiness of our time. It's a perfect message for our culture, because I find myself being abusive of my time. I overschedule myself. I get too busy. I spend too much of my time doing things that I think God probably doesn't really want me to do. And I spend too little of my time doing the things that I think God probably really does want me to do. And in this period where I'm forced to be more mindful of time, could I begin to have a perspective shift on how I use my time? Could I begin to make different commitments to how I use my time? Could I begin to become more aware of how little time I have, not just in every day, but in my entirety of my life on this planet, in this life? Can I begin to think about how I want to use that limited time to glorify God, to love others, and to accomplish God's will in my life and in the world, rather than just the things that I think need to be done? This is a challenge for us in this time where we are sitting in our homes, and we should begin to reflect and think more about Sabbath time and how it has an impact on our thought about time throughout the rest of the week. Come back tomorrow when we're going to be talking about Sabbath as relationship, as a practice of relationship. We're going to reflect some more this week on the Sabbath.